All right, so let's take a look at the second example here. It's being tested by the test method contains email test, fairly straightforward, as is the name of the method that we're wanting to test. File contains email. You can kind of see it takes a file name and a candidate. Let's go take a peek at the implementation real quick. Okay, not a lot to this. It opens the file provided to it and presumably searches the file for the candidate email supplied. Very simple implementation. Again, illustrative purposes only. So we can go back to the test and run the test here. Okay, so that took longer than it needed to, but I cut most of that out for you. Bottom line is that it succeeded. We can look at our properties here and see that test file name is this emails.txt. That's included with the unit test project. By the way, I'm going to provide a link to the repository for this. You can peep it in the comments below. Emails.txt, and the test email is this one. And if we look in emails.txt, we can see, sure enough, there it is. So that's all pretty straightforward and a good positive test case. But let's look at our Gandalf code here. So we can see here where we have supplied something that sounds like the wrong thing in the first parameter and kind of sounds like the wrong thing in the second parameter. But let's, that's a possible thing that might happen out in the wild, either by hook or by crook, like I said earlier. Kind of like we talked about in the first example. What happens when we get basically the wrong data? Either just poorly formatted data or stuff that doesn't match what we're expecting. There's any number of legit reasons that you might get bogus data coming in. What happens if we now rerun this method with bad parameters? System.io file not found exception. What a surprise. You trying to tell me that there's no such file as fee-fi-fo-fum? Oh, well, how interesting. Let's go take a look at our method here. Well, sure enough, we're just trying to read the file with no try-catch, no validation on the file name, and we don't even make it to this spot because we couldn't read the file, so there's nothing in contents, and we get the exception on this line. We're going to use some of the same techniques to remedy this test case that we used in our first example, but we're also going to go a little bit beyond that. Let's look at the slightly improved version of this method. Well, we can see first off, we've got a good start. We're checking to see if the file name provided and the candidate provided are legitimate string references. And if they're not, we're not doing any of that. We're returning false. So that's a good start. Oh, by the way, this would be an excellent spot to reuse that method we worked on in example 1. If you're doing reuse properly, you're ahead of about 75% of the people out there. But really, this is insufficient validation for this particular case because, for example, our test case would pass this. The addition that we made to the test case will fly right on past that because the file name is not null and the candidate is not null. So we're going to go ahead and add a couple of secondary checks. One is simply that, if the file exists. If it doesn't, then we're just going to return false. Now, in a production app, you're probably going to have logging scattered throughout. You're probably going to want that here and in other places. So just remember, this is for illustrative purposes. That's a good step. We want to make sure the file exists. And if it doesn't, we just say, nope, the file clearly doesn't contain the email because the file doesn't exist, while also logging perhaps that we tried to look for a file that wasn't there. But we want to go just a little further and say, how do we know that the current user can access this file? I'm going to leave that as an exercise. And I recognize that you could just do two things here. You could just wrap all this in a try-catch. And if you catch an exception, return false. Or you could just let the caller handle it.
Now, some of y'all are saying, well, just let the caller handle it. It'll be fine. The caller can handle it. Well, that ain't always the right answer because sometimes the caller can't handle it.
Once again, a lot of noise, but still a decent point. Sometimes passing the exception up to the caller isn't the right move. All right, so let's rerun this test now with the right assertion again and see what it does here. If the file doesn't exist, we return false. And we don't think this file exists anywhere. So let's run this sucker and see what happens. All right, cool. Good deal. So in the first case, which was our initial test scenario, we determined that, yeah, we can take a valid file name with a valid email and see if that file contains the email supplied. In our second case, we're no longer bombing out on the file not found exception, which is cool. And listen, a lot of what you're hearing in this episode is really all about making your software easy to use right and difficult to use wrong. Things aren't always this simple out in the wild, but we can make things easier on ourselves if we, avoid unhandled exceptions because a file doesn't exist. In most cases, that's not a terminal condition.